Good day. I'm Liesl Pretorius, Head of Legal with Freedom of Religion South Africa. This week, I'm discussing state regulation of religion with 4SA Executive Director Michael Swain. Now, the Chair of the Commission for Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Rights, or the CRL Rights Commission, Mrs. Thoko Mkhwanazi-Xaluva, has announced that she is forming a committee to push through legislation that will implement a system of state regulation of religion. In a recent interview with Newsroom Africa, she proposed the establishment of state-appointed peer review committees that will determine whether or not to grant individuals a license to work as a religious practitioner or to operate a church or any other religious institution. And these peer review committees will also have the authority to suspend or dismiss religious leaders found guilty of wrongdoing. So this is a serious concern from a freedom of religion point of view. And with us today is 4SA Executive Director Michael Swain to tell us a little bit more about this. So Michael, to start us off, are there other countries where there is state regulation of religion in place?
Yeah, the answer to that question is yes. And perhaps more concerningly, it is a growing trend in sub-Saharan African nations. The problem is this, that if the state takes the view, which it absolutely should not, that freedom of religion is a privilege rather than a right, you have a major problem on your hands. Because if it is simply a privilege, like, say, driving a car, if you break the rules enough times, you can have your license taken away, then you don't really have a right to religious freedom at all. You just simply have it as a privilege. But as it is, Section 15 of our Constitution gives an unqualified right, obviously within the framework of the rule of law of this country, to freedom of conscience, thought, belief, opinion, and faith. And so when you see any initiative that seeks to push back or to erode, or particularly by the state control, freedom of religion, that is essentially the death knell of religious freedom. Because if the state controls it, you no longer have it. If they can say who can and cannot preach or teach or open a religious organization, then you've effectively lost that right. So it is a growing trend in Africa. It's happening in Kenya. It's happening in Uganda at the moment. It's happening in Namibia. It's already happened in Angola and Rwanda. We can come back to that because those are good examples of what it looks like when you do have state regulation of religion. But it is something which we absolutely need to oppose.
So Michael, some people would say that there are criminals who hide behind freedom of religion to do their criminal activity and kind of use that as an excuse or a defense. And some would say that state regulation of religion might help to deal with it. What are your comments on this?
Well, this is often the main thrust as to why the state proposes that it needs to regulate religion. You might recall that the CRL produced a report under the previous dispensation with the same chair, entitled The Commercialization of Religion and the Abuse of People's Belief Systems. And what they did in that was they pointed out that there were several criminal abuses that were taking place. There was the Prophet of Doom, remember him? And then there was Bushiri. There was all sorts of bad things happening in the religious sector. Actually, I shouldn't say in the religious sector, in a tiny fraction of the religious community. But as we subsequently pointed out, and as we argued and proved, these were criminal acts. And so to answer the question, no, you absolutely cannot hide your criminal activity and say somehow freedom of religion is a defense or a protection for me. A crime is a crime is a crime. It doesn't matter if you're a pastor, a politician, or a postman. If you break the law must deal with you. And we have plenty of robust laws in South Africa that literally dealt with every single so-called abuse that were identified in the CRL Rights Report. And the question, therefore, isn't should we not have more regulations? Of course, we shouldn't have more regulations. If you're not enforcing existing laws, either because of a lack of capacity or maybe a lack of political will, what on earth makes you think that putting another layer of regulation on it's going to solve the problem? It obviously won't. So this is not a good reason why you should have a system that imposes state regulation of religion.
Yes, especially if, as you say, there are existing laws and the issue is that they will not be enforced. What is the use of getting more laws, more regulation, and they're not enforced? And the downside is that it will diminish religious freedom, which is very important. Now, something that the chair of the commission mentioned during her interview is the existence of regulated professions. Certain professions, doctors, lawyers, accountants, they are regulated professions. They're professional bodies that oversee them. And she raised the point that religious practitioners are also just professionals, and they can be regulated in a similar way. What do you say about that?
Yes, well, that's what she's essentially proposing, is that there's some form of peer review committee, and in her words, they will sit down and assess each person and grant them a license or not to run a church. So that's her view. But it's a fallacious argument, because unlike all the other professions that you've mentioned, there's a body of knowledge. There's a body which obviously of knowledge that you need to know. You can't go and practice the law if you know nothing about the law. But faith is something completely different. It's fluid by nature. And there is no standard interpretation of faith or doctrine. Faith is something which you have in your heart, and you are entitled to and protected by law, as long as it's obviously within the realm of law, to believe whatever it is you want to believe. You know, the Constitutional Court has declared that even if a belief is irrational, illogical, incapable of any form of scientific proof, it is still protected by our Constitution. So you can't regulate faith. You can believe in the man in the moon if you want to. You can believe anything you like, as long as, of course, you don't break the law. But one of the problems, of course, is that this is an issue where we really have to draw a line, because you cannot standardize your view on faith. There are over 40,000 denominations just of the Christian faith in the world. That clearly means that we do not all agree on interpretation of doctrine. So a peer review committee will almost by definition be unconstitutional, because it will be imposing someone's belief on someone else, and that's unacceptable.
So we know that unfortunately there are a handful of charlatans out there, and I've spoken to religious leaders from various faiths that have expressed concerns about misguided theology, etc. So some would say that these peer review committees, a good reason for them, and in one of the purposes of such a committee, would to stamp out charlatans and stamp out what some call misguided theology. Of course, we are faith neutral, so we don't take a position on that. But would this not be a good thing? What would you say to somebody who's concerned about charlatans or misguided theology?
Again, that's one of the CRL's argument. Mrs. Xaluva was on television saying that she was going to set up a committee made up of religious leaders to help push through legislation in Parliament and to convince parliamentarians that this thing needs to happen. But here's the problem. As soon as the state tries to impose or gets behind any orthodoxy, it is state control, state regulation of religion. And it is emphatically not and should never be the role of the state to involve itself in some form of doctrinal interference, least of all trying to impose some form of doctrinal conformity. Now, that folly has been seen literally throughout the centuries of bloody warfare in Europe, for example, where states backed one particular interpretation of scripture versus another. And that is one of the main reasons why, by the way, religious freedom as a right has now been universally recognized. The CRL, in its last report, and presumably they'll take the same position, it sets itself up to be, and I quote, the final arbiter of religion. It will have the final decision powers regarding any dispute in the religious community. And that is a deep problem, because the state should never get itself involved like that. We have in our legal system something which is called the doctrine of entanglement, where the courts are very hesitant, and rightly so, to involve themselves as arbiters, let alone interpreters of religious organizations' tenets of belief or their internal workings and structures. So it should definitely not be the case. In fact, interestingly enough, and I think it's worth mentioning, this whole matter was thrashed out over a 4-year period. There were 5 days of hearings in Parliament. Parliament turned around at the end of that and said that they did not support the CRL's initiatives to set up some form of regulatory peer review mechanism. And the president himself, Cyril Ramaphosa at the time, said that government would not go overboard and start regulating churches and religions because, as he said, it would be considered unconstitutional to start regulating faith-based organizations. So one of the questions we have to also ask is, why are we here again? This is very concerning that after all that has gone before, we are back now in the same position with the CRL chair, the same CRL chair, pushing the same agenda.
As you say, Michael, it is very concerning because we've been through this. This issue has been ventilated in Parliament for 5 days, and here we're sitting with the same proposal. But could I ask you, we know that there are people who are manipulated through religion, certain perhaps vulnerable people, especially to give money. Will this proposal by the CRL not help to implement a system that will help prevent fraud and corruption and the exploitation of vulnerable people, especially to give money to religious institutions?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that if you defraud or cheat people out of money, that's a criminal offence. And we're back to the same argument that we've already made, that the law is the law. It must be enforced. It must be applied. And obviously, if you are a religious organization, or if you are even an individual pastor, you are subject to the laws of this country regarding revenue and money and how you deal with your money. So there are deep regulations in that instance, and they've even got a little bit tougher. I mean, now we've recently had a law passed which says that you must register if you want to, for example, send money overseas or to receive money. So these areas are regulated. But the question comes down, well, would it help? And rather, maybe more correctly, what is government's role? Should government intervene to try and help people who are gullible or vulnerable? Where does gullibility start? Where does faith end? You know, some may argue, and probably would, that it's actually crazy if you are giving any money at all, least of all a tenth of your earnings or more, to a religious organization, believing in an unseen, unknown, unknowable God. That's what they might say. But of course, if you are a person of faith, you know differently. But is that being gullible, or is that a matter of faith? What about the example in the Bible, for instance, of the widow's mite? She put her entire livelihood into the treasury, and the Lord Jesus Christ was literally watching her and commended her. Was he supporting the abuse of people? Well, of course not. So we have to really be careful when we start saying that the state has some form of role to intervene to protect people from their own choices, from their own financial gullibility. And I'd also like to say that if they are so concerned, then of course the first thing they should do is to shut down casinos. They should end the state lotto, because that is definitely where a lot of vulnerable people are putting money that they really cannot afford.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Michael. So this proposal that is now apparently back on the table, this proposal to regulate a religion in South Africa by pushing legislation through Parliament, what is the implication of this for the faith communities of South Africa?
Well, I think if it goes through, and obviously we're still a long way away. I mean, you know, if they even get halfway right, it will be put into some form of legislation. And then because of our constitutional lawmaking process, there will be obviously opportunities for public comment, public participation. But it is something which we believe should be opposed very swiftly before it actually gets traction, so to speak. If you look at what the implications would be, assuming it all went through, well, look no further than, as I mentioned at the beginning, Rwanda. You know, Rwanda in August last year, 2024, it was reported that 9,800 what they call prayer houses and 7,000 illegal churches had already been shut down. Now, in Angola, where there's a similar piece of legislation, where only pastors who have a recognized government theological degree can practice as religious practitioners. They also have a 100,000 membership threshold for churches before they can even be registered illegally. And again, it's been reported that over 2,000 churches have been shut down in Angola. And by the way, including 46 mosques. So when the state gets control of religion, as we can see from these other examples, it ends really, really badly for quite a lot of people. And it is absolutely the death knell of any meaningful form of religious freedom. And that's exactly why we must be awake, we must be alert, we must watch this thing like a hawk, and we must move as quickly and as, let's say, powerfully as we can, obviously within the realm of the law, to make sure that it is very clear to government that this is not something that is supported by the faith communities of South Africa.
Yes, certainly, Michael. And this is something that, as you say, that 4SA will be watching like a hawk. We will take that stand for faith and freedom to protect it in South Africa. Now, for viewers who want to know more about 4SA, you're welcome to visit our website. The address is www.4sa.org.za. You can subscribe to our newsletter. That way you will learn more about this matter and other important updates. We're also on social media, on YouTube, on the channel where you will be watching this video, or also on Facebook. And I would also like to ask that for SA, we're completely dependent on donations. It is because of the goodwill of donations that we're able to stand for faith and freedom. So we ask that if you are so moved to please also support our work, that we can continue to stand for faith and freedom and to impose a serious threat to our religious freedom, for example, state regulation of religion. Thank you.
Good day. This is Thoko Mkhwanazi-Xaluva, legal advisor at 4SA. Remember to like and share this video and then click on the subscribe button to make sure you never miss our video updates on vital religious freedom issues.